is Malia, and our team consists of Shane, Lee, and Jimmy. In this video, we will be covering Chapter 11 of How Economics Explains the World. The name of the chapter is Inflation Targeting, and throughout this video, we will be discussing the chapter's core idea, key mechanisms, misconceptions, and overall takeaways to help you understand the topic. We'll also provide a worked example to showcase Andrew Lay's knowledge. To start us off, the core idea of this chapter is explaining how the economic policies from the 20th century shaped how inflation is targeted, as well as in explaining how different approaches to economics have shaped inequality in the world today.
Economic inequality is best described as the inequality between different groups of people based on income, wealth, and opportunity. So, in a more equal economy, most people would see their wages rise alongside the growth of their economy. But in a highly unequal society, growth is most concentrated at the top. Meanwhile, the working class would see very little improvement in terms of wages or standard of living. This brings us to the idea of the Great Decoupling. For a majority of the mid-20th century, productivity and wages moved in tandem. As workers yielded a higher percentage of profit, their pay increased at roughly the same rate. This can be seen in this graph here, showing the behavior between the U.S.'s economic growth alongside workers' median wages. But however, starting between the 1970s and 1980s, workers' wages started to stagnate and eventually tapered off entirely. The data in this graph helps to explain how the economy can appear strong, having a high GDP and a rise in production, but still have its workers struggling. Understanding the Great Decoupling allows people to understand that this widening gap is affected by not only individual choices, but also structural changes in the economy, for example, changes in policy. This allows us to ask a crucial question. If productivity is rising but wages remain stagnant, what's causing this gap to continue to widen?
In the past, letting politicians control the money was a disaster because they would often pump up the economy right before an election to look good, which usually led to a big crash afterward. To fix this, countries gave control to independent central banks, which act like the economy's thermostat. Their goal is to keep inflation at 2%, the Goldilocks setting. If it hits 0%, it's too cold. Prices drop and people stop buying because they're waiting for a better deal tomorrow, which eventually kills the economy. If it hits 10% or more, it's too hot and your paycheck becomes worthless because prices rise faster than you can spend. To stay at that 2% sweet spot, central banks use interest rates like the gas and brake pedals of a car. You can think of interest rates as the price of moving money from the future into today. When the economy is speeding and the prices are rising way too fast, the central banks hit the brakes by raising interest rates. This makes loans for things like cars, houses, and credit cards more expensive. When it costs more to borrow, people will get a little more stingy and spend less, which eventually cools down the prices and stops inflation from spiraling. On the other hand, if the economy is stalling, businesses are closing, and people are losing their jobs, the bank hits the gas by lowering interest rates. Suddenly, it's cheap to borrow money again. This tips the balance for a family to finally buy a home or for a business to take out a loan to hire new workers. By tapping the right pedal at the right time, the central banks tries to keep the economy moving at a steady pace without crashing into a recession or bumping up from a high price. So now I'm going to show you what I was talking about earlier. The brake is the 0%, that's really bad. 2% is the sweet spot in the middle, and the gas pedal is the 10%. So when there's higher inflation, central banks starts raising interest rates borrowing becomes more expensive and less spending and investments happen equals lower inflation, slower wage growth. This stabilizes the prices but can cool labor markets, bargaining power, and slowing wage growth.
In explaining a key mechanism of inflation targeting, Jimmy mentioned how the central banks aim for a rate of inflation at roughly 2%. The big question to ask here that Andrew Lay also asked is, and I quote, have inflation targeting and central bank independence been a success? The answer here is yes, and Lay explains this in the book. Now, instead of reading out from his page, I can explain that with data provided by the Federal Reserve economic data. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is a graph that provides the data on the Consumer Price Index, which is CPI for short, for all urban customers in the United States. Now, if we start by looking at the 1970s, we were met with oil shocks, and the CPI rose, which is a reflection of high inflation rate. And this remained around 6% for a good decade. And then in the 1980s is where you see that big peak where it even peaked at 14%. Now, in the 1990s is when New Zealand introduced the 0 to 2% goal to their nation. And soon a lot of other countries followed the idea of targeting inflation directly and keeping it within the 0 to 2%. As stated in the book, most countries have adopted this goal and has led to a much steadier increase in inflation and CPI levels. And as you can see, for the rest of this data, even though you can't see the percentage change as well, it is roughly around the 2%, and therefore we can conclude that the CPI change was much lower and steadier by means of inflation targeting as well as central bank independence.
This brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions that comes up whenever people talk about inequality and the Federal Reserve. A lot of people hear that inequality has been rising since the 1980s, and they hear that the Federal Reserve has been running monetary policy over that same period. And they jump to the conclusion that the Fed must be causing the wealth gap. At a first glance, that sounds reasonable, but the Fed does control interest rates, which affects borrowing in markets, so it feels like they must be responsible. Lay argues that this is actually the wrong way to think about the Fed's role. Lay describes the Federal Reserve as a blunt instrument, and I think that metaphor is really helpful here. The Federal Reserve is really good at doing one specific job: controlling inflation. If inflation gets too high, the Fed can raise interest rates and cool things down. If inflation is too low, it can lower interest rates to stimulate spending. The Fed cannot target inequality directly. So essentially, the Fed can put out a fire, but it can't design the house. In this analogy, inflation is the fire. The Fed has the hose, but then things like tax policy, labor laws, and social programs are the blueprints of the house. And those are controlled by Congress, not the central bank. Monetary policy works on the entire economy at once. When interest rates go up, they'll go up for everyone. When they go down for everyone. That's why we call it blunt. It's not precise enough to redistribute income or close wealth gaps. So when inequality rises, blaming the Fed is kind of like blaming a thermostat, because some of the rooms in the house are bigger than the others. The thermostat controls the temperature, not the layout. Why does this distinction actually matter? First of all, central bank independence is crucial. We want the Fed to be insulated from politics. If politicians controlled interest rates directly, they'd have a huge incentive to keep rates low before elections to boost short-term growth, even if that caused runaway inflation later. History shows that when politicians interfere with monetary policy, the result is usually higher inflation. Coupled with economic instability, and overall just worse outcomes for everyone, especially in lower income households who were hit the hardest by rising prices. Second, confusing monetary policy with fiscal policy leads us to aim our solutions at the wrong target. If inequality is driven by factors like tax structures, education access, healthcare costs, globalization, or weakened labor protections, then adjusting interest rates will not fix it. Those issues require fiscal decisions made by Congress, not rate changes made by the Fed. Finally, this distinction matters because it helps us have a more honest policy conversation. When we blame the Fed for inequality, we let the institutions that actually control redistribution off the hook. The Fed's job is to keep the economy stable. Addressing inequality requires to deliberate political choices about how resources are distributed. So the takeaway is the Federal Reserve can stabilize the economy, but it cannot reshape it. Inflation control is a necessary foundation for growth, but closing the wealth gap is an ultimately fiscal challenge. Another major misconception is that lower inflation is always better for the economy. At a first glance, low or even zero inflation sounds ideal. Prices aren't rising, so people assume their money goes further and the economy is healthier. But in reality, inflation that is too low can be just as dangerous as inflation that is too high. When inflation falls too much or runs into deflation, people begin to expect prices to keep falling. When that happens, consumers delay making big purchases like cars, homes, or appliances. Why buy today if it will be cheaper tomorrow? These expectations matter. In economics, expectations are one of the key factors that shift the demand curve. If people expect lower future prices, demand shifts to the left, meaning less spending occurs right now. When everyone waits, businesses sell less, profits fall, hiring slows, and wages stagnate. This creates a stalling effect that can push the economy toward recession instead of encouraging growth. Ultra-low inflation can freeze economic activity. This is why central banks typically target around 2% inflation. That small amount of inflation encourages people to spend and invest today rather than waiting, while still keeping prices relatively stable. So the takeaway is that price stability doesn't mean zero inflation. Modest, predictable level of inflation helps keep the economy moving and prevents the kind of demand collapse that can make downturns worse.
At the end of the chapter, Lay helps us understand economic behavior by comparing it to sports. He mentions the importance of market structure and how the effect of monopoly power is even greater in sports than in regular economy, and how a competitive market is important to encourage people to innovate and prevent a so-called walkover. Take football, for example. If one team dominated any other team, we wouldn't be as interested in watching the sport. If the Seahawks, for example, won every single football game they played, then watching the games and Super Bowl wouldn't be as exciting. Competition drives people by the incentives of possibility. Whereas competition in a monopoly is so difficult, growth across the board is hard.
To end off this podcast, we'd like to highlight some of the important takeaways from Chapter 11. The first takeaway that you should remember is inflation control and how it became a primary focus for modern economic policy. Throughout the end of the 20th century, central banks became more independent and targeted inflation directly, leading to a success in keeping inflation steady. Another takeaway is to note that economic growth is shaped by economic policies, yet so is inequality. Andrew Lay highlights that just because the world is more globalized today and the fact that technology is constantly improving, that doesn't mean that all the problems in the world are getting smaller. Inequality is in fact growing larger. The poor are getting poorer while the rich are getting richer. Nations are tackling these issues differently, yet the problem is still at large. With those two takeaways, we will end this episode, and we thank you for listening.